As you all know, as we all know, in the 20th century, this country made a decision to abolish racial segregation. We thought that racial segregation was wrong. We realized that it was immoral. We understood that it did great harm to both African Americans and whites in this country. And we understood that it was unconstitutional. It was a violation of our Constitution to separate the country by races. And we began in the 1930s, first with civil rights suits that desegregated law schools, and then we went on to desegregate colleges and universities. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated elementary and secondary schools were a violation of the Constitution. And then the civil rights movement grew, and the result of that civil rights movement in the 1960s, we abolished segregation in everything from water fountains to buses to lunch counters to public facilities of all kind. And yet, having done that, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is segregated by race. I've lived in many of them. I've lived in New York and Boston and Chicago and North Carolina and Denver and Los Angeles and San Francisco. I've moved around a lot. Every metropolitan area that I've ever lived in had clearly defined neighborhoods where whites and only whites lived, and clearly defined neighborhoods where African Americans and only African Americans lived, with rare exceptions. And we accept this environment of a racially segregated country, even though we made these decisions in the 20th century that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful, and unconstitutional. But we accept residential segregation as sort of part of the natural environment. We're aware of it all the time. It's not that we've tried to undo it and have failed. We've never even tried. It's not something that we feel obligated to do anything about. We feel badly about it, but we don't think it's our responsibility to desegregate neighborhoods. And the reason for that is maybe not hard to understand. It's a lot harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains. If you pass a law saying that you can't have separate water fountains for blacks and whites, well, the next day people can drink out of any water fountain. If you pass a law saying that you can't have separate sections on buses for blacks and whites, the next day people can sit anywhere they want on the bus. But if you pass a law saying we can't have separate neighborhoods for whites and blacks, nothing much happens the next day. And so it's a more difficult thing to undo once we've segregated the country by neighborhood, by race and by neighborhood. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. We've given a name to that myth. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. All of these individual accidental decisions is what caused our residential segregation, and because it happened by accident, we tell ourselves it can only be undone by accident. It's only if something happened by government, by regulation, by law, by public policy, do we have both the opportunity and the obligation to reverse it. Well, I, like you, accepted this reality, never thought there was much we could do about it, believed in the idea of de facto segregation, segregation by accident, but throughout much of my career, I was studying education policy. And in the course of studying education policy, I came to the conclusion, and it's not a hard conclusion to come to, that the major cause of the differences in average achievement between low-income African-American children and middle-class white children was not, as federal policy has it, because teachers have low expectations or are not held accountable enough for raising their children's test scores, but because of the social and economic conditions with which children come to school. And I won't go into it in great length this evening, but just to give you one example, if we know that African-American children living in urban areas like Chicago have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. If you have asthma, you're likely to come to school drowsy because you've been up at night wheezing. If you have asthma, you're likely to be maybe sleepless or absent more often for the same reason. And I reasoned and I wrote about this that if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, every conceivable respect, except one group has asthma at a higher rate than the other and is going to come to school less often and be drowsier when they come to school, that group is going to have lower average achievement no matter how high teacher expectations are, no matter how much teachers are held accountable for their achievement, and no matter how often they're tested. Of course, there are going to be exceptions. There are always going to be some children with asthma who will achieve at higher levels than typical children without asthma because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But on average, this makes a difference. And I wrote about many of these conditions that predict a lower average achievement for children who come to school with social and economic challenges, whether it's lead poisoning or the lack of high-quality early childhood education, or coming from homes where the parents are less well-educated and vocabulary is less sophisticated, or being exposed to violence and coming to school in conditions of stress, or coming to school from conditions of stress because of parental unemployment. All of these conditions, each one of them, will predict lower average achievement. And again, as always, it's not to say that some children with any of these conditions aren't going to achieve at higher levels than average children, but on average, each one of them predicts lower average achievement. And I then began to realize, and I'm a slow learner, so it took me a while, but I began to realize if you take these conditions and you take children who have these conditions and you concentrate them in single schools so that every single child has one or more of these disadvantages, or almost every single child has one or more of these disadvantages, the challenge of overcoming them becomes nearly impossible. If you have a couple of children in a school with these disadvantages, they can get special help and special attention. But if every single child in the school is coming to school either with asthma or lead poisoning or lack of a high-quality early childhood experience or stress from either violence in the neighborhood or economic conditions at home or homeless, if you have every child in the classroom that way, reinforcing their own disadvantages, the achievement gap is inevitable. And we call schools, as you all know, we call schools that have children with these conditions concentrated within them, we call them segregated schools. And so I became, just as an education writer, concerned with what we can do about segregated schools. And in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that dealt with this issue. The Supreme Court decision concerned an attempt by the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, to desegregate their schools in a very trivial way. Both school districts, Louisville and Seattle, had a choice program, and parents could choose which school their adolescent children could go to, and the adolescents as well could participate in those choices. But both school districts said that if the choices of children would further exacerbate racial segregation, those choices would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would help to integrate the school. So if you had a school that was almost all white, a high school that was almost all white, and both, there was one place left, and a black and a white child both applied for it, the black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. It's a trivial program. Most adolescents don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their friends. And the cases where you have one place left in the school and both a black and white child apply for it, almost non-existent. But this trivial program was declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. And the opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts, and Chief Justice Roberts reasoned that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I agreed with that. I thought he was right. That's why schools in Seattle and Louisville were segregated. In fact, I happen to know that schools today are more segregated than they ever have been in the last 45 years. We have more school segregation today in this country than any time in the last 45 years because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. But then Chief Justice Roberts went on to say, well, the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because of the kind of private accidental choices that people made and that discriminatory actions that individuals took that had nothing to do with government policy. It was because people like to live with each other of the same race, he said, and because private homeowners and real estate agents and banks discriminated, and because of income differences. It was accidental segregation, what he called de facto segregation. And he said that if you have de facto segregation, it's prohibited for a school district to take account of a child's race to try to desegregate a school. Only, Chief Justice Roberts said, if you have de jure segregation, segregation by law, public policy, regulation, government-sponsored, government-created, government-enforced segregation, only then, not only is it permissible to desegregate, it's required that we do so to remedy the constitutional violation. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about a case in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1950s when a white homeowner in a middle-class suburb called Shively of Louisville had an African-American friend. He was a Navy veteran, decorated Navy veteran, middle-class family, wanted better housing for his family. He had a young daughter, tried to buy a home in a middle-class suburban area. No real estate agent would sell a home to him or show him a home in that neighborhood. So the white homeowner bought another home for his friend and resold it to his friend in this suburb of Shively. And the African-American Navy veteran moved into the home with his family. A mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw stones through the windows. They firebombed and dynamited the house that the African-American family had moved into. And when the riot was over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and then jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation. Maybe there's more to it than John Roberts thinks. And I'm exaggerating a little bit. I had known other incidents in the past of various ways in which the government contributed to racial segregation, but I hadn't understood that it was a complete system that created a de jure system of segregation that's just as unconstitutional as the segregation of buses and water fountains and lunch counters and schools. So I began to accumulate the evidence, and that's what resulted in the book that I'm talking about this evening called The Color of Law. And what I demonstrate in this book is that, as I said, the racial segregation that exists in every metropolitan area in this country is not de facto. The notion of de facto segregation is an utter myth. It was created by racially explicit government policy, government regulation, designed to ensure that nowhere in this country could African Americans and whites live near one another, designed to ensure that we created separate residential areas by race everywhere in the country. So let me spend some time this evening talking about the major policies that the government followed in creating this residential segregation. One I'll begin with is public housing. Now, I suspect most of you think you know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. It's lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without hope, without jobs, access to jobs, working in the informal or underground economy, selling drugs or loose cigarettes, or not having much hope for a better future for themselves, engaging in confrontations with the police that often result in violence or riots in some cases. That's what we think of as public housing in this country, but that's not how public housing began. Public housing began in the New Deal. during the Depression, when the Roosevelt administration, elected in 1932, the following year established the Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, and it built the first civilian public housing in this country. And it built the first civilian housing, public housing in this country, always on a segregated basis. And I'm not talking about the South. I'm talking about the North, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic states, the Midwest, here in Chicago, elsewhere. Always on a segregated basis. Frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Because in the mid to early 20th century, there were many integrated neighborhoods in urban areas in this country. That may surprise you as well, but if you think about it, you'll realize that almost all jobs in that period of time were located in downtown industrial areas. Workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. So if you had an industrial area where African Americans and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants and Jews and migrants from rural areas were all working at jobs in this industrial area, without automobiles, they all had to live close enough to be able to walk to work. Sometimes there were streetcars. They took short streetcar rides, but they lived in broadly the same neighborhoods. And I'm not just in the North and the South as well. The South may have had Jim Crow and water fountains, but it didn't have Jim Crow in residences. African Americans and whites lived in many of the same neighborhoods. Not all neighborhoods, but many of the same neighborhoods. Some of you may have read the autobiography of Langston Hughes, the great African American poet, novelist, and playwright. He describes how he grew up in a downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland as being an integrated place. But he grew up there. He says his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It was called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland. But the Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood in order to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a segregated pattern in Cleveland that reinforced whatever tendencies Cleveland had before to be a segregated community. And this was an integrated community that where it was built, so it would not have been difficult for the Public Works Administration to build non-segregated projects, but it chose to build segregated projects and did this everywhere in the country. I like to talk in my book, and when I talk about these things, about places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, because these are thought of as being liberal places. And it seems to me that if you can understand that it even happened there, you can understand that it probably happened everywhere. Cambridge, Massachusetts, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that area. Maybe some of you went to school there, lots of colleges in that area. The area around MIT, the Central Square area, was in the 1930s a community that was about half black and half white, integrated community. The government, the federal government, destroyed housing in that neighborhood in order to build segregated public housing. One project for African Americans, another project for whites. These projects were not for poor people, by the way. This was the Depression, and there were many working class families who couldn't find homes. They couldn't rent apartments. And so the federal government was building housing for working class families, not for poor people. They paid the full cost of the housing in their rents. The government wasn't putting out any money over the long term for these houses. Of course, it had to advance the construction costs, but it got it back on the rents. Not the kind of public housing we think of today. And most of it was for whites. There were a few projects for African Americans, but always segregated. Even in Atlanta, there was a downtown area called the Flats. Both African Americans and whites were living there, about 60-40 ratio. So it's a pretty integrated community. But the federal government demolished housing there and built a segregated project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were living in that area to find housing elsewhere, to double up with relatives and move to less adequate housing. During World War II, the situation became even more extreme. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production to take jobs in war industries. There hadn't been a lot of jobs in the Depression. It was World War II that recovered the country from the Depression and provided full employment for the first time. And many of the communities where workers flocked to were communities that weren't previously segregated. The one I talk about in my book is a suburb of Berkeley called Richmond, California. Richmond is a deep water port, so that's where the largest shipbuilding center on the West Coast was for warships. Liberty ships being built there. The Kaiser shipyards didn't exist before the war. By the end of the war, the Kaiser shipyards were employing 100,000 workers. At first, they would only hire whites. They wouldn't hire African Americans, but as the war went on, they exhausted their white labor supply, and if the ships were going to continue to roll into the bay, they had to hire African Americans. They sent recruiters throughout the South to find workers to come to Richmond to work in the shipyards. Richmond itself, just a suburb of Berkeley, as I say, was a small town, 20,000 people, all white. There were a few African Americans living in its outskirts who were related to Pullman car porters who were living in near the terminus of the Intercontinental Railroad. But it was basically a white community. It was a population, as I say, of about 20,000, tiny. I don't know how a community of 20,000 absorbs the families of 100,000 workers in a period of just 4 years. It's inconceivable. The government had to build housing for these workers. And so it built segregated housing. It built housing for the African Americans, temporary housing, not well constructed along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area near the shipyards. It was temporary because the city of Richmond announced that at the end of the war, any African Americans who had come there to work would have to leave. And it built housing for the white workers, more stable housing in the residential areas east of the coast. It created segregation here where it hadn't previously existed. There was no segregation because there wasn't a substantial African American population in the area. In fact, throughout California and the West Coast, there were very few African Americans before World War II. There were some who had come in the 19th century for the gold rush. But aside from that, and for the Pullman car porters who lived in an integrated neighborhood in Oakland, because they had to live close enough to the railroad terminal to be able to walk to work. But aside from that, there were no African Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area. But the government had to decided to segregate that area by building separate projects for African Americans and whites. And it could have been so different. In fact, we have what social scientists call an existence proof. There was one shipyard north of San Francisco in Marin County, the Marin Shipyards. That grew so rapidly as the war proceeded that only single men could come to work there. They couldn't accommodate families at first, and they showed up in such great numbers that the administrators of the barracks that they put up just handed out pillows and blankets as the workers came, and they couldn't segregate it. It was happening so fast. And they found that there were no problems as a result of having segregated barracks for white and black men. So when the families came, they built integrated public housing. Marin County was the only place that I know of in the country that had integrated housing for war workers during the war. And it worked. There was no reason why it couldn't have been done everywhere. And this, as I say, happened everywhere throughout the country. Everywhere where there was a defense plant, the government had to build housing, and they built it on a segregated basis. Creating segregation or reinforcing segregation where it otherwise might not have grown the way it did. After the war, there was an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no housing been built during the Depression, but during the war, it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes. The only housing that could be built was housing for defense workers, for workers at these plants. And you had millions of war veterans returning to the country, needing housing, forming families. That's where the baby boom came from. They were doubled up with relatives, tripled up with relatives, living in Quonset huts on open fields. There was an enormous crisis, shortage of housing. And President Truman, who was then president, in 1949 proposed a vast expansion of the national public housing program to accommodate these returning war veterans. And remember, we're not talking about poor people. These are people who had jobs in the post-war boom, in the economic boom after the war. But there was no housing available for them. The government wasn't proposing to build subsidized housing for poor people. It was proposing to build housing for returning war veterans. And conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat the expansion of public housing that President Truman had proposed for this purpose. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, because it was segregated, and they had no problem with that. They didn't want to defeat it because they didn't like poor people, because this wasn't for poor people. It was for returning war veterans who had jobs. They wanted to defeat it simply because they thought that public housing was socialistic, that the government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. It should be the private market that takes care of the needs of returning war veterans, even though the private market wasn't taking care of their needs. And so they came up with a device to defeat the program that President Truman had proposed. It's a device that is well known to observers of politics. It's called a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy is a strategy that opponents of a program in Congress employ. They propose an amendment to a bill that they oppose. And the amendment, they think, is an innocuous amendment that will pass. But once it's passed, it will make the entire bill unpalatable, and the bill will go down to defeat. As an aside, perhaps the most famous poison pill effort in recent memory was in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was being passed, and Southern segregationists and other opponents of the Civil Rights Bill thought they could defeat it by proposing that we not only extend civil rights to African Americans, but to women as well. And they thought that if they could get that amendment passed, when the entire bill came up for a vote, it would be so ridiculous that the Civil Rights Bill would go down to defeat. And they misjudged, and that's why we have non-discrimination provisions by gender in the Civil Rights Bill. They didn't succeed in defeating the final bill after they attached this amendment to it. But going back to 1949, conservatives in Congress had a poison pill strategy. They proposed that an amendment to the National Housing Act be added that provided that from now on, all public housing had to be integrated. No more discrimination in public housing. Segregation would be ended in public housing. And they proposed this amendment, cynically, of course, assuming that they would vote for it, this integration amendment. Northern liberals would also vote for it. That would create a majority. And then when the amended bill came up for a vote, they would flip and vote against the amended bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who are all in favor of segregated public housing, but not integrated public housing, and the entire bill will go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress campaigned against the integration amendment. Liberals in Congress campaigned against the integration amendment. The campaign against the integration amendment was led by the leading civil rights advocate in the United States Senate, Hubert Humphrey. So a name some of you will remember. I see enough bald heads and white hair here to know that some of you will know who Hubert Humphrey was. The year before, he had led an effort at the Democratic National Convention to add a civil rights platform to the Democratic Civil Rights Clause to the Democratic platform. So he was the leading civil rights. He campaigned against the integration amendment. He persuaded all the Northern liberals, with rare exceptions, to vote against the integration amendment. The integration amendment went down to defeat. The full public housing bill came up before Congress as a continuing segregated program. It passed. And that vote by Congress to prohibit integration, or actually to reject non-discrimination in public housing, was then used by the federal government as the justification for segregating all of its programs for the next 15 years, not just public housing. 1949, well, to those of us with bald heads and white hair, wasn't so long ago. We're just talking about only yesterday. Well, under the 1949 Housing Act, some of the giant towers that we're familiar with here in Chicago, places like Robert Taylor Homes or Cabrini Green, the iconic Pruitt Igoe Towers in St. Louis, I'm sure many of you have heard of those. These projects were built under the 1949 Housing Act, again, not for poor people, but for returning war veterans who needed housing, always on a segregated basis. And very shortly after that, a development occurred around the country which was quite surprising and nobody expected. But all of the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. All of the black projects had long waiting lists. And this happened not just in Chicago and St. Louis, but everywhere. St. Louis, as I mentioned, the Pruitt-Igoe projects, we call it Pruitt-Igoe, it was actually two separate projects. The Pruitt projects were for African Americans and had long waiting lists. The Igoe projects were for whites, they had large vacancies. And soon the vacancies increased and the situation became so untenable that the government had to open up all public housing to African Americans. Gradually, they became predominantly African American. About the same time, industry left the cities. And there were fewer jobs to which public housing residents had access. We no longer, industry previously was dependent on either deep water ports or railroad terminals. But once the highways began to be built, they could move out to rural areas and to the suburbs and have more land and not have to have elevators and dividing up their assembly lines. So they moved out of the cities. People in public housing, now overwhelmingly African American, became poorer and poorer because there were no jobs. Eventually, the projects came to be subsidized. They were no longer covering the cost of the housing in residence rent. Once they became subsidized, investment in public housing declined, maintenance declined, and public housing became the kind of vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing in the late 20th century. That's not how public housing began. But the question that I hope is arising in your mind, because it arose in mine when I read this history of public housing, is why did all these vacancies develop in the white projects and not in the black projects? These were returning war veterans, blacks and whites. They all had jobs in the post-war boom. The African Americans might not have had the better jobs. Whites monopolized those, but they all could afford rent to pay the rent. Why all these vacancies in the white projects and not the black projects? And the reason for that is another federal program which was even more powerful in creating segregated communities. And that was a program that was run by the Federal Housing Administration. And it was a program that was designed to segregate the entire white population into single-family homes in the suburbs. It's actually a program that the federal government began as a propaganda campaign in right at the end of World War I, after the Russian Revolution, when some geniuses in the Woodrow Wilson administration decided that the way to prevent white workers from becoming Bolsheviks was to get them into single-family homes in the suburbs and become property owners. But this was a federal program. Why are you laughing? And they actually, the Department of Commerce in the 1920s actually sent community organizers. Some of you, I know, I met some of you who have community organizing experience. The Department of Commerce actually sent community organizers to white neighborhoods in urban areas and told them that the way to avoid racial strife was to move to the suburbs. After I published the book, I came across a poster that the Federal Housing Administration had produced. And it was a poster. The picture was of an African-American man being led away in handcuffs by police, and the headline was, "Escape Crime, Move to the Suburbs." This was a federal government propaganda campaign. But it didn't have much effect because the working-class families, no matter how much they wanted to believe the government propaganda, didn't have the money to afford single-family homes in the suburbs until the Federal Housing Administration began a massive subsidy program to suburbanize the white population. And they did this by recruiting a cadre of mass production builders of giant suburbs everywhere. The most famous of these, and I know you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes. Some of you may have heard or remember hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing that was written by Malvina Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. This was another giant subdivision built south of San Francisco. Los Angeles, which became the symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s, had giant suburbs, Lakewood near a McDonnell Douglas plant, and Panorama City in the San Fernando Valley. All of these were giant suburbs. This was not how single-family homes were originally created. Before the FHA recruited these builders, if a family wanted to own a home in the suburbs, they had to buy some land and find a builder to construct it. And maybe there was a builder occasionally who was really a risk taker and was willing to build 3 or 4 or 5 homes in the same location and hope to sell them. Nobody could build 15,000 homes in one place like Levitt, or 17,000 homes like Levitt did, or 15,000 like the one south of San Francisco. The only way Levitt could assemble the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans for the subdivision, which included what kinds of materials he was going to use, what the architectural design of the homes was, what the layout of the streets were, and make a commitment to the Federal Housing Administration that he would never sell a home to an African American. And the Federal Housing Administration required him to place a clause in the deed of every home in Levittown prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. It was a federal policy to segregate the white population into all white suburbs outside urban areas. And suburbs were built in this way all across the country. They were inexpensive homes. Levittown and the others that I mentioned, Levittown itself was 750 square feet homes. Very small, modest homes for workers. My uncle, white, was a returning war veteran. He was able to buy a home in Levittown with an FHA, a VA mortgage. His job was stocking vegetables in the supermarket. That's the kind of people who were able to move into these homes. African Americans could easily have afforded to live in those homes. They sold, they're small homes, as I say, they sold for about $8,000 or $9,000 a piece in those days. And inflation adjusted, today's money, that's about $100,000, a little less. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $100,000 with an FHA or a VA mortgage. For veterans, it required no down payment. So these were easily affordable to African Americans as well as to whites, but by federal policy, African Americans had to remain renting in either public housing or in the private market in cities, and whites were to become homeowners in single-family homes in the suburbs. What are the consequences of this today? Well, those homes that were sold in hundreds and hundreds of these suburbs around the country to whites only by federal policy gained over the next 30, 40, 50 years value. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, those $100,000 homes. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next generation or two equity, wealth, equal to the difference between $100,000 and the present market value of their homes, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in wealth. In this country, most middle-class, working-class families gain what wealth they have from the equity in their homes. They use their paychecks to live on. They don't save money. That's not where wealth comes from. Wealth comes from home equity in this country. So as a result of this federal policy to segregate metropolitan areas, we now have a situation where African-American incomes are 60% of white incomes. Not close, but not that far either. The difference is largely also attributable to federal policy in the labor market, which I'm not going to talk about here, but I do talk about some in the book. Their average American incomes are 60% of white incomes. African-American wealth is 10% of white wealth. And that enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 20th century. And that wealth gap controls much of the inequality that we have in this country today. It's the reason that, well, when the de facto theory says that African Americans just can't afford to move into middle-class communities, well, it's true, they can't. They don't have money for down payments. But that's a federal creation, an unconstitutional federal creation. The wealth gap that creates and perpetuates the segregation is responsible for the concentration of the most disadvantaged young people in this country and why we have riots like Ferguson and Milwaukee and St. Paul and other places that we've seen in recent years, and hundreds of them earlier in the 20th century. It's the reason why, as I said at the very beginning, we have an achievement gap in schools because of this federal housing policy. Now, in the book, I describe many, many other federal, state, and local policies that came together to create this system of state-sponsored segregation, of unconstitutional residential segregation. And there's really nothing in my book that hasn't been written about before. It's all been documented. I didn't have to do much original research. I didn't spend years in archives finding things that nobody knew about. This was all well known only 50 years ago. The subtitle of the book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Everybody who moved into one of these suburbs knew that they were racially exclusive. African Americans knew they were prohibited from buying homes in these suburbs. I wrote in the book about a family, an African American family. Some of them were returning war veterans. They formed a trucking company. They were businessmen. They delivered construction materials to sites. They had a contract with Levitt to deliver construction materials to Levittown, but they weren't permitted to buy homes in Levittown, even though their incomes were probably superior from this business to many of the working-class white families who were permitted to move into it. There are many, many other policies that the federal government and state and local governments followed. Here in Chicago, one that I write about in the book is the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago, under the presidency of Robert Hutchins, who was a well-known educator, and any of you who know about anything education know that Robert Hutchins was a leader in reforming high schools in this country, very highly respected. But he was president of the University of Chicago from the late 1930s to the early 1950s, and during his presidency, he maintained a staff of lawyers working for the office of the president in the University of Chicago, whose job it was to sue African Americans who moved into homes in the neighborhood around the University of Chicago to get them evicted. Now, you may say, well, the University of Chicago is a private institution. That's de facto segregation, right? It's not de jure segregation. Well, it's de jure segregation for two reasons. One is, and the courts later agreed on this, that in order to pursue those suits, the courts had to enforce these covenants that were attached to deeds in every home prohibiting sale or occupancy by African Americans. But more importantly than not, the University of Chicago is a tax-exempt institution. And this was an open policy. I'm not suggesting that any time a nonprofit organization with a tax exemption from the Internal Revenue Service does something wrong, it then becomes a violation of the Constitution. But when a University of Chicago or churches throughout the Chicago area and everywhere else, every metropolitan area in this country were active openly in segregating the neighborhoods surrounding their institutions, the IRS was violating the Fifth Amendment when it extended tax exemptions. It was violating the Internal Revenue Code as well when it extended tax exemptions to the University of Chicago or to any of the churches or other nonprofit institutions that took action explicitly, openly. I'm not talking about secret action. Openly, that was known to the IRS, known to anybody who looked to segregate their neighborhoods. It went from the top to the bottom. I'll give you the most trivial example I found, and you can fill in the spaces in between, or you can read my book to fill in the spaces in between. But I was looking through an African-American newspaper in a town called Culver City, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. You may have heard of it because it's where movies are made these days. But it was a white suburb of Los Angeles. You won't know about this kind of thing in Chicago, but during World War II, cities on the East Coast and the West Coast, like Culver City, had air raid wardens who had to go door to door in the evenings to tell people to close their curtains or they had blackout curtains or dim their lights to avoid giving guidance to either Japanese bombers on the West Coast or German bombers on the East Coast. And the city attorney of Culver City, according to this newspaper article, convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens in Culver City. And he gave the air raid wardens in Culver City blank form exclusion agreements so that they might as well be efficient when they were going door to door to tell people to turn off their lights. They might as well make sure that they signed agreements enforceable under law, agreeing never to sell a home to an African American or never to rent to an African American in their community. That was the lowest level of government activity. This was not de facto segregation. This was a government system from top to bottom that was designed to create segregation in this country. Now, as I said earlier, I used to specialize in education policy. I really don't know anything about housing. This was not my field. I got into this because I was concerned about that Supreme Court decision that prohibited us from desegregating schools. But because I knew a lot about education policy, it was natural for me in the course of writing this book to look at how the textbooks in every high school and middle school in this country teach this history, the American history textbooks. And I found, as you might imagine, that every one of them lies about this. It's a sort of a scientific way of describing it. The most commonly used American history textbook that I looked at least 2 or 3 years ago when I looked at this, it was the most commonly used one. It's called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages that the kids have to carry around in their backpacks. In those 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph devoted to the subhead is discrimination in the North. Within that paragraph, there's one sentence devoted to housing, and the sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. You know, I said earlier today that, I write books, as you know. That's why I'm here. I write articles. I know that publishers spend a lot of money hiring copy editors to look out for passive voice sentences. This is one they missed. African Americans, they woke up one day, they looked out the window, and they said, hey, we're in a segregated neighborhood. Look at that. This is a crime. Because if the next generation doesn't know this history, learn this history any better than our generations have, they are going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So every one of you, and I know you're from a number of different communities here. Some of you are even educators. Every one of you has contacts with a local school, or your children go there, or your grandchildren go there, or you know teachers or principals or superintendents or school board members. And this is one way that every one of us can get involved at the very beginning to redress this crime, to teach this history accurately. Because unless we understand this history, unlike most history, this is not purely of academic interest. The foundation of our legal preservation of segregation depends on a misunderstanding of the history. It depends on this myth of de facto segregation. So unless we can persuade an effective section of the American public, the educated American public, the influential American public, that the government created segregation, that the segregation, as I said earlier, in neighborhoods around this country is as unconstitutional as the segregation of water fountains. Unless we can understand that history, we're not going to be permitted to undertake the aggressive policies that are needed to address it. Because if it happened by accident, it's not going to unhappen by accident. If it happened by explicit government policy can undo it. And it's not difficult to think of the policies that can undo it. I devote a chapter in the book to it, but that's not my main purpose. But the policies are not hard to imagine, and they wouldn't be hard to implement if we had political support for it. So I urge you to begin at this least to help me and to join with many others like me in trying to make this history known so we can develop the political foundation for desegregating this country, which we're obligated to do under our Constitution and which we're obligated to do as citizens if we want to call ourselves a democracy and a constitutional democracy. Of course, understanding itself won't be enough. No civil rights victory has ever been won simply by people having the understanding of the importance of doing it. We need a more vigorous civil rights movement that's going to undertake the same kinds of actions that past civil rights movements undertook around this issue, whether it's marches or demonstrations or civil disobedience. But the history is the first step. So I urge you, as I say, to communicate this history to people you know, to learn it yourself, so you will be motivated to join that civil rights movement when it becomes strong enough to create reform. So thank you very much, and we'll take some questions. Well, there are really two questions that you have there, and I'm going to separate them a bit. I said several times that there were many, many policies that the federal government followed to create segregation. One of them was the construction of highways to separate black from white neighborhoods. Here in Chicago, I'm sure you've all heard of the Dan Ryan. And the Dan Ryan, not by accident, separates what were, when the Dan Ryan was built, white from black communities. And that was on purpose. That was something that was explicitly done. The mayors and city planners, highway planners, were not bashful about saying that that was their purpose in designing these routes. So that's that. And so what I don't know specifically about Austin in the question you're asking. You're talking about Austin, Texas? Yeah. Well, I don't know specifically. Mm-hmm.
And it was designed to keep blacks out of the west side of Austin, force them to move to the east side. And now the population of Austin has dropped dramatically. It's like 6% of the population.
Yeah. Yeah, well, like I said, I don't know specifically about Austin, but that was commonplace. Many cities had city plans which designated black and white neighborhoods explicitly in the city plans. Various policies, the highway system being one of them, were used to reinforce that plan. In the South, and this is something that didn't happen in Chicago because we didn't have here in Chicago official school segregation, but in cities like Austin and Raleigh and Houston and Atlanta, many, many cities in the South, the school boards and the cities worked together to implement the racial city plan by placing schools. Remember, we had segregated schools there. So they placed schools in a way that would force families to move out of integrated neighborhoods and into segregated ones. So, as I said, in the early 20th century, we had lots of integrated neighborhoods. But school boards placed schools for African Americans in the area that was designated for African Americans, and they placed schools for whites in the area that was designated for whites. So families wanted their children to be educated. They had to move into segregated communities, and that was a major tool that was used in many southern cities to create segregation that hadn't previously existed.
Richard, right here. So I was hoping to ask a question more about education policy. At the start, you spoke about the connection between living conditions and the achievement gap, and also some of the issues with desegregation programs. I guess my question has two parts. Do you think that desegregation programs in schools are logistically impossible? And if so, do you think that funding equity programs could do anything to help lessen that gap?
Okay. Well, there are certainly programs that we can do to try to accomplish some desegregation of schools without addressing residential segregation. In borderline areas between black and white neighborhoods, we could redraw attendance boundaries, for example, so that African Americans and whites, that's not a problem, I think, here in Evanston, as I understand, but certainly in Chicago and in other big cities, in the borderline areas, we could redraw school attendance zones so that the schools became integrated. But most African American and white children in this country live too far distant from borderline areas for that to be a reasonable program to accomplish much desegregation. So the question is, should we spend more money to improve schools in segregated neighborhoods for African American children? Of course we should, but we should be careful. We're not advocating, I hope, separate but equal schools. And some of the advocacy of that kind of reform, which I support, we need to improve conditions in low-income communities. It's certainly not something I would ever oppose. We should support it. But it shouldn't be seen as a substitute for desegregating those communities. This has been a debate that has gone on for 60 years in this country. To what extent should we be trying to revitalize, is the term, the common term today, should we try to revitalize ghetto neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage, and to what extent should we help people move out of those neighborhoods where there's no opportunity and into high-opportunity neighborhoods? And inevitably, what the policymakers decide is, well, it's too politically difficult to have mobility programs that help move people out, so we'll just try to revitalize the communities. It's a separate but equal strategy. Of course, it never works. Once you embark on that kind of program, there's not enough political support to pour money into low-income communities because those people don't have enough political power to vote. And so, we started in model cities in the 1960s, and then since then we've had enterprise zones and empowerment zones. It's one fad after another to try to bring more jobs and more opportunity to low-income communities. It always fails. The only program that can succeed, but we have to decide to do it, is to desegregate the country and create the kind of country that we say we believe in and where people have equal opportunity.
Susan?
Hi, my name is Gail Schechter. For nearly a quarter of a century, until a couple of years ago, I ran the Fair and Affordable Housing Advocacy Group that covers this 16-community area. So I really appreciated all that you said, and when people would accuse me or my organization of social engineering and trying to promote fair and affordable housing, we would say it was social engineering that got us here. But my comment is that with this rate, and I also, if you want to read a book about the history of the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was all about fair housing, there's a book that came out. I wrote the chapter on the North Shore. It's called the Chicago Freedom Movement, Civil Rights in the North. So the comment I wanted to make is that today the issue of racial segregation has morphed into an issue of affordable housing, because with the segregation by race also produced segregation by wealth, and it also created a situation which was also kind of engineered, which is the concept of home rule and school funding that is through the property tax, and that increased the amount of segregation by income as well as race. And so when people looking to address racial segregation, they should consider advocating for affordable housing as a way to break through that.
Well, I agree with you. I don't. That wasn't a question, but I agree. But you did remind me of something. I want to say this now. I mentioned earlier that none of this history I described was new. It's all been written before. I did very little archival research, but the core book, the key book about how this happened in Chicago, was written 25, 30 years ago by Arnold Hirsch, and it's called The Making of the Second Ghetto. And Professor Hirsch died yesterday, and we should remember him and read his book. You don't have to read mine, read his. Okay.
Richard, over here.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for writing this book. I really enjoyed it. It doesn't have it paints a clearer picture of what exactly the government has done and continues to do. And the concept of, de jure segregation versus de facto, I think that it's just right on point. So I just wanted to thank you for your comments and your research. I think it's a very well done book. My question is, I'm a housing professional, so I know about the low-income housing tax credit program. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was just passed, December 2017, it has a provision that reduces the mortgage interest deduction, which in your book you call it an entitlement program. And you compare that to Section 8 program where, there's always a waiting list, and if you don't get there first, it runs out. But the mortgage interest deduction, it basically helps homeowners to finance their properties and to continue this, wealth gap that you just described. I want a prediction as to how you think this new law will impact that, if at all, because now you have the standard deduction and you can choose if you itemize or not. And for a lot of people under that $750,000, threshold, it may make more sense to deduct, and I think it incents renting as opposed to, previously it was housing. The other thing is another new development out of that same tax reform is opportunity zones. And a deadline is coming at the end of this quarter for the governors to select which areas are now going to be opportunity zones. And this could be, this could be another tool, right, that is abused or used correctly to revitalize a lot of neighborhoods that are distressed. And I want your insight on those two things.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I agree with you, by the way, that the mortgage interest deduction reform in the current tax bill is going to have much impact. It was designed, it was a politically designed tool that was designed to affect places with very, very high property values, not typical middle-class homes, not typical middle-class suburbs. So what it did was it capped them at $10,000. Which applies, it affects, people in New York City pay $10,000 in property taxes, and people in California may pay, but very few people in Illinois pay $10,000 in property taxes that they did. Very few, I said. No, I'm talking in one of those areas where it's possible, but very few people do. And limiting the deduction to $10,000 is not going to do much because this $10,000 can still be deducted. So it's not going to do that much to take away the incentive for the mortgage interest deduction. You mentioned the Section 8 program, and that's, I think many of you are familiar with that. It's a subsidy program, a program where the government gives families an amount of money that will help them to rent apartments while paying no more than 30% of their income in rent. And the Section 8 program is designed so that the amount of the subsidy that the government gives them is based on the average rent in the area of their local housing authority. And this program reinforces segregation. It doesn't have to be racially explicit the way the programs I described earlier were, because once we've created these structures, programs like Section 8 reinforce segregation. They reinforce segregation for a number of reasons. One is, if you think about it, if your subsidy is based on the average rent in a housing authority area, that subsidy is going to be too low to rent in the higher opportunity neighborhoods and the middle-class neighborhoods where rents are higher, and it's actually going to be too high to rent in segregated low-income neighborhoods. Landlords in those neighborhoods can exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. So the result is that people use their Section 8 vouchers to move to already segregated low-income neighborhoods. A family with a Section 8 voucher is more likely to live in a low-opportunity, segregated, high-poverty community than a family of equal low income who lives in a less segregated community. So it reinforces segregation. Another program just like that is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a subsidy that the Treasury Department gives to developers to construct low-income housing. And it's used to reinforce segregation because developers of low-income housing would much rather build their housing in already low-income neighborhoods. They'd rather do it because the land is cheaper there, mostly because they don't have to go through 50 community meetings explaining what they're doing and defending what they're doing. And, they put up a building. It might be a very nice building. It might be justified on the basis of what we were talking about before. It's going to revitalize the neighborhood. But, they can put up a sign in the window and potential renters can walk by. They can rent the vacancies easily. We could very easily redesign that program so that the tax credits were given to developers who committed to build in high-opportunity communities where the residents would have access to jobs and transportation and schools where achievement was high. So there are many things we could do if we wanted to desegregate. We just need the political will to do it.
Were there any lawsuits about the discriminatory clauses in the housing contracts?
Yes, there were a small number. There was one Supreme Court case in 1948 which prohibited courts, local courts, from enforcing these deeds clauses that prohibited sale or rental to African Americans. That didn't stop them, but there was a Supreme Court case along those lines. But mostly the civil rights legal community from the 1930s on focused on school desegregation. And it was a very poorly resourced civil rights legal community. The NAACP, which eventually, the lawyers eventually became the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, it was a nickels and dimes operation, actually more a nickels operation than a nickel and dimes operation. It survived on contributions from very poor people. And they were engrossed in the school desegregation fights and never really focused on housing segregation, partly because housing segregation sort of snuck up on them. It started in the New Deal. In the course of my research, I read letters that Thurgood Marshall, the lead litigator of the NAACP, wrote to President Truman protesting these restrictive covenants in Levittown. But it never really got, in 1954, the NAACP won Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate schools. And the day after the Supreme Court handed down that decision, Thurgood Marshall and the other leaders in the NAACP held a press conference, and they said, okay, we've won school desegregation, now we're going to turn our attention to housing. But of course, there was massive resistance to school desegregation, and the lawyers were consumed for the next 20 years trying to defend Brown versus Board of Education. And by the time they began to think about housing, the structures that I described were already completely in place.
Richard, over here.
Okay. That's good. Closer, okay. I'm vice president of the District 65 School Board. Our school provides K through 8 education. And while we are a diverse community and a diverse school district, we're not always equitable school district, and we're working to explicitly address that. And part of that work is building in more culturally relevant and historically accurate curriculum. So I'm curious if you have any particular suggestions in terms of resources for educators, families, and children to access more accurate curriculum, given that it's typically a pretty narrow market that has a fairly controlled interpretation of history. And we certainly would like to provide more accuracy for children and families.
Yeah. I thank you for asking that question. This frustrates me greatly that we don't have a curriculum that I can hand out to teach this history. But I am working with several groups who say they want to develop such a curriculum. And if you send me an email, when it's developed, I'll send you a copy. And that's true of everybody here. And, you know the group, I'm sure, Facing History. They're talking about developing such a curriculum. Rethinking Schools, maybe you're familiar with that. They are also talking about developing a curriculum. But this history that I've described in my book, it's only been out for 10 months now, and I wish. I wish I could have written a curriculum at the same time I was writing the book, but it'll take a while, but we'll get there.
Susan? This question goes back to his lawsuit question, and you got to help me with this. Where are the lawsuits today? I had a buddy who was a professor at Northwestern who was looking to buy a single-family house in Evanston. We looked at a 2,000 square foot house on Florence and Greenwood. He saw another 2,000 square foot house almost identical in North Evanston. And the costs were drastically different. Why are we tolerating that, I guess? I mean, we want to say it's a, quote, good neighborhood. But for the people that are struggling to afford the overpriced small houses in Evanston, and I'm one of them, where are the lawsuits of today? I always hear about the past lawsuits and the ACLU and this group and that group. You've done great work in this book. Can you feed a new form of a lawsuit as step one to bring some equity? Because we're all participating in discrimination, and it's mostly found through housing. And this is why I bought your book last summer, for that very reason. So just, help me. What are you going to do for the next step to create some new great lawsuit? I don't know.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. This is just a history book that I've written. So I'm not going to do anything as a lawyer to do these things. But, I think the only way I disagree with you on is that lawsuits cannot be the first step. Lawsuits always ride on a civil rights wave, on mobilization, on activism, on public awareness, and also it's complicated because the unconstitutional actions that created the structures which still exist today, so there's still unconstitutional racial boundaries, but the policies themselves were followed so long ago that nobody would have standing to sue today. So litigation, there's still many opportunities for lawsuits. I'm not saying there aren't, but it's not going to be the major route because nobody can come to court and say that, I don't have wealth today because my grandfather was prohibited from buying a house in a white suburb. That the way our legal system works, you don't have standing to sue in that kind of situation. The way lawyers are going to get involved in this is if we start enacting policies like the school desegregation plan in Louisville and Seattle, or we start, let's say the most important policy we could probably enact is a prohibition on zoning ordinances in high opportunity communities and wealthy communities that prohibited the construction of townhouses or apartments or even single-family homes on small lot sizes. If we understood this history, we would understand that those zoning ordinances are unconstitutional. They're designed to preserve an unconstitutionally created exclusivity. So we could pass a law like that, and then somebody would challenge it, and it would go to court. And civil rights lawyers would have to defend that policy. So it would be the reverse. They would be defending a policy of desegregation. They wouldn't be initiating a lawsuit to try to change it. So I'm not saying that lawyers wouldn't be involved, but the first step is to get those kinds of policies enacted so that we'll have something to defend. And that requires political mobilization, support what I call the new civil rights movement, to make that happen.
Richard. Thank you. Hi, my name is Dawn Johnson, and I'm a public policy doctoral student and also an educator. And I have a couple questions, and I have a couple statements too. I look at 4 areas that that segregation affect African Americans: banking, housing, education, and criminal justice system.
And what?
Criminal justice system. And if the government started desegregation of African Americans from white, then should not the government be the one to end it? Why is it taking so long to look and see that this is not the right thing to do? Why it has to start from the ground up instead of the government recognizing that this is not the right way? Because the government is just like, it is, for the government, they are people. The government is not just an isolated group. It's run by leaders. There are policies here in the United States between one group, the Democrats, and one group, the Republican. And they carry out those policies through budgetary constraint. So therefore, it's very difficult for African Americans, and as an African American, woman, I have faced discrimination, and I'm just wondering if you think that desegregation was not a result of discrimination against African Americans and the perception that they have towards us. Because we just really, I for myself, I'm really tired of just not having equal opportunity. Even though I'm educated, even though I have the same skills as other people in employment, in my previous job, I have to train the person who was qualified, that they said I wasn't qualified to get the job, but I have to turn around and train the qualified. So I think this is a complex process. Rather, it's not an easy step to say, okay, we can just try to desegregate our communities. Because of the heart of discrimination is a perception that towards black people. I read it on the internet. We're told to go back to Africa, so that means even those who were born in this country not considered Americans. So it's a very complex issues that we're faced, and I just feel like blacks just need opportunities. We spend a lot of time with trying to break down the structures and the walls, and it's like hitting against a mountain, like big wall. So I feel that we should focus more on opportunities, equal opportunities, and then that should give us a better chance of moving forward, that we have equal access to the banking system, equal access to housing, and how we're going to do it, I don't have an easy answer.
Well, okay. Well, okay, that wasn't the question, it was but let me just respond in a short way. I agree that this is not going to start with the government. The government only takes action when it's forced to do so by a change in public opinion. And that's why I say we need a new civil rights movement. I'm actually hopeful. Writing this book made me hopeful. That may surprise you. But it made me hopeful because I came to understand that if it happened by accident, there was nothing we could do about it. But if we understood that it came about by government policy, then we can understand that government policy can undo it. And there are many, many policies that we could follow. But first, it has to be a mobilization of the public that understands the need to make these changes. So far as your maybe I'll stop there, and it wasn't a question, so I don't need to ramble on. Yeah.
Playing off the question about affordable housing over here, last year California passed 15 laws, and some of which override local zoning in order to stimulate more affordable housing. I do not believe it was, to create racial equity, but I wonder if state mandates that override local zoning laws is going to be the way to go in solving some of this.
Well, there are, one of the disturbing trends in this country today is state mandates that override local jurisdictions that try to increase equity, whether by affordable housing or in other ways as well. So I agree that's a problem, and it's a political problem that we need to address. I don't know that I have any more to say about it than that. As we begin to focus on these issues, we've got to focus on that at the state level and ensure that local communities are permitted to demand affordable housing. But as I say, we need, at a national level, we need a prohibition on zoning laws that prohibit that from happening. And it can be done first at state levels. States can prohibit those kinds of ordinances, which exist in wealthy suburbs everywhere in the country, and sort of lock in the segregated patterns that we have, and states can change those.
Hello. My quick question is that the first part of your speech where it was talking about was like the civil rights movement, right? We did that civil rights movement. We passed laws to be able to get non-segregated buses and also non-segregated water fountains, and then after that, it also led to segregated housing. So I guess my question is, sure, we can pass policies to be able to unsegregate housing and things like that. Things might be that simple on paper, but at the same time, do you think it's a question of like our federal government just being an oppressive institution, and also just like the policies that they try to pass just end up becoming racialized against like people of color, more specifically black folk? Or is it just we're not, or is it just a question of our federal government not doing anything?
Well, we shouldn't minimize the civil rights victories that we achieved in the 20th century. This is a very different country now than it was then. And we shouldn't minimize any of that progress. We have, well, the biggest progress may be in the growth of an African-American middle class today that is pretty substantially integrated into mainstream American society. As I told you before, I probably shouldn't keep saying this, but I'm an old man, and in 1965 in Chicago, I had a job in which I was a researcher working for the Chicago Urban League. And my job was to count and identify every job in the corporate sector of Chicago in any corporation. We identified, I and a team of researchers, identified 4,000 policy-making jobs in the private sector in Chicago. Not a single one was held by an African American in 1965. Not a single one. The only African Americans with executive positions in the private sector in Chicago at that time were working at banks and insurance companies that were serving African American segregated neighborhoods. Today, any corporation in Chicago that didn't have many black executives, not just one, would be subject to a lawsuit and would be subject to opprobrium and public rejection. So in 1970, 10% of young African Americans had college degrees. That is, the survey of the African American population, 25 to 29-year-olds in 1970, 10% had college degrees. And as I say, those who had college degrees were working mostly in service industries that served the black population, whether they were doctors or dentists or lawyers or bank executives, small bank executives. Today, 24% of African Americans have college degrees or more, and are working not only in institutions that serve African Americans, but are in major corporations and medical professions and throughout. So we've made enormous progress. I don't want to minimize that. But as I said, we've left unaddressed the biggest segregation of all. And I'm hopeful that we do have a new civil rights movement that can emerge. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement is the beginnings of something very hopeful. I said this afternoon, that in the late 1990s, President Clinton decided to have a national conversation on race, and after he talked to himself for a week or two, he dropped the idea. Well, we're now having a more accurate and passionate national discussion about race than I think at any time in previous time in American history. It's not just the Black Lives Matter movement. I urge all of you to, if you haven't already done so, to go online and look on the New York Times website and Google the speech that Mayor Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, gave when he removed the statue of Robert E. Lee in New Orleans. 2 or 3 years ago, it was inconceivable that a white elected Southern politician would make a speech that so accurately and passionately described the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow that still affect this country today. And that's an enormously positive development. So, and I don't like to boast about my book, but it's had a stunning reception. I wrote this book. I've written books before. I assumed I'd write the book, I'd put it aside and move on to my next project. I've done nothing but go around the country speaking about this topic. So there's an enormous receptivity to this information. So I think we need to build on it. And, I've suggested some ways we can build on it, but really, let me say this, it's up to you. It's not up to me. I'm not going to be around when we accomplish all these policies. But you will be, and I'm counting on you to make it happen.
Mr. Rothstein, I want to thank you for your presentation. Having lived in Evanston all my life and in Chicago, which is considered one of the most segregated cities in America, recently we have here in Evanston several organizations, the Community Partners for Affordable Housing and the Housing Opportunity Development Corporation, where you could leave your home or set aside to this organization that it will remain affordable for 99 years here in Evanston. So far, we only have about 12 houses that are that way. And I'm encouraging all the white people here this evening, if your children don't want to come to Evanston and live like mine, said they'll never come back here, I am thinking about leaving my house to one of these organizations. So at least it'll keep it. So there are affordable things going on, and there are questions. I have no confidence in the government, the current one, or HUD, that they will ever do anything to eliminate these current policies. But we as a community, and yours, your book, that's reaching a large audience, will encourage us and inspire us to do more locally to make our communities be more affordable.
I agree that your book is very powerful and will have a major impact on the country. I've heard you talk before about the term social engineering and how it's been turned on its head. Can you talk about that some?
Well, I don't know what you're referring to, but Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, said that we shouldn't engage in integration programs because that's a form of social engineering, and that it's going to have unintended consequences that are harmful. And I wrote a long article responding to him saying that this is an attempt to undo social engineering, not to engage in social engineering. Not surprisingly, my book, well, I was surprised. I hadn't thought, I should have realized it, but my book has had a great reception among conservatives because it's a criticism of the government. But, so they think it's great. Here's this left-winger writing a criticism of the government. And then they say, well, you're right, everything you say is right, this is what the government did, but two wrongs don't make a right. So the government created it, but the government shouldn't undo it. And that's such a silly argument that it's easy to rebuke, and only the government has the power to do this. But it's not, I agree with the people who are making statements about this. The government is not a separate entity, it's us. And what we force the government to do is what the government will do. And, but only the government has the power, once we force it to do it, to desegregate this country. And the policies it could follow are easy and simple, and many of them not costly. For example, the what I described a minute ago about the Section 8 program or the low-income housing tax program, that wouldn't cost a cent to simply use those programs to desegregate rather than to segregate. It wouldn't cost a cent to prohibit exclusionary zoning ordinances. Some of the most important policies that we could follow would be cost-free. Now, there'd be expensive programs, too. We ought to subsidize African Americans to buy homes in suburbs that they cannot now afford because of unconstitutional federal policy, and that would be expensive. But most of the policies we follow would not be expensive.
I want to make a quick announcement. We're at 8:40, so we're going kind of long. We're going to take two more questions. Richard already spoke to 200 ETHS students during first and second period this morning. He did another appearance downtown today at noon. So it's been a pretty long day, and he's got a 6 a.m. flight. So we're going to get two more questions in. He will sign books out in the hallway. You have another chance to ask another question out in the hallway, but I just want to be a little mindful of time. So please, ma'am, we'll take one, and then this will be the last one over here.
Okay, real quick. Are you still local?
Am I what?
Do you still live in the area?
Oh, no, I
That's
live.
a shame.
No.
Okay. And have you heard of the Poor People's Campaign?
The Poor People's Campaign? You mean
This
from
was-
many years ago?
Right, from Martin Luther King
Sure.
Jr. So in 1968, his call to action was to, I'm going to read off of the mission statement, to unite people across the country to challenge the evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted morality. Sadly, we haven't gotten very far. And they are doing a national reboot of this, and it's actually launching in Evanston tomorrow night at Grace Lutheran Church at 1430 South Boulevard and Wesley in Southwest Evanston, not far from here, at 7 o'clock. So it's, open to all. It is not necessarily faith-based, right, Gail? It's for all people. So we're hoping this is going to be the next movement to really address this.
Thank you.
And you're welcome if you stick
No,
around.
I wish I could, no.
Okay, last question over here.
Hi, I think the Cook County voters yesterday backed into an important policy change. I think the voters in Cook County yesterday backed into an important policy change in that we elected a reformer to head our tax assessment system. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that race and familiar if this has been done in the rest of the country, because we are very hopeful, and it happened for a variety of reasons, but a concrete reason was this major research that came out this past week or month on the discrimination in neighborhoods of color on the tax system. And I was wondering if you have any success stories. I mean, we've begun this, but I want you to meet with Fritz Kagi.
I'm sorry, was that a question? I didn't get the final question. What was it?
If you are familiar with other counties or taxing
Oh.
districts that have had success in
Okay.
shortening their assessment cycles and
No.
looking at their assessment system for homes.
No, I'm not. In my book, I devote a section to describing how many communities, including Chicago, had a discriminatory assessment system, a racially discriminatory assessment system, in which homes in black communities were assessed at a higher ratio to market value than homes in white communities. In the early 1970s in Chicago, the community with the lowest assessed values relative to market values was Bridgeport. And the community with the highest, what's so funny about that? And the community with the highest assessed values relative to market value was West Lawndale. And Chicago wasn't the only place, but it's a very complicated thing and very time-consuming thing. Actually, Zillow and that kind of thing makes it a little bit easier today. But in order to identify this discriminatory practice, you've got to look at the sale prices of every home and its assessed value and compare it, and it's a very time-consuming process. And so I don't. There have been some studies done of it. In Chicago, the ProPublica recently published a study of it in Chicago demonstrating that the policy still exists, and perhaps that contributed to the election result yesterday. But it exists in other cities as well.
Thank you to Richard Rothstein. Thank you so much.